Hey, I just wanted to take the opportunity to share something kind of cool with you while I have it. And I'm sorry about the clickbaity best. We all know that best is a subjective term, like the best flavor of ice cream, which is apple butter. Fight me in the comments. But you know, I mean, it's an opinion, I guess, except apple butter is still the best ice cream. However, I think this is something that is objectively the most audacious car stereo ever put in a car by the factory. It may not be the best, but no one else has filled the trunk with subwoofers like this. And I thought that would be something to share with you. So this is my wife's car right here, and she doesn't have this crazy stereo in it. This is something that was available in 2003 and 2004 Ford Mustangs, and I'm gonna stop talking and show it to you. This was factory, and as you can see, they've got these two big plastic molded subwoofer enclosures that take up half your trunk space. They've got this big amplifier rack here with giant words all over it, and this would have had 4 individual amplifiers mounted across the top of it in the factory system. The guy who owns this doesn't have those amplifiers. In fact, the reason I have these right now is because he asked me to rewire the subwoofers to work with a modern amplifier because he doesn't want to run those amps because they specifically call for the whole rest of the thing, and he wants it all to be modern just with this. So what's interesting about this, in addition to the fact that they thought it was totally okay to take up half of your trunk space, is that these are 2 separate moldings. So these aren't like the same mold mirrored over and turned around. These are individually fitted. And there was also a bunch of other bracketry that went with this because, of course, since it's in a car that's going to be moving down the road and it's from the factory, it had to not flop around and whatever. And obviously they're not bolted down here. But I'll show you what all that stuff has. One thing I do want to call to your attention that's kind of interesting on these is since these are opposed to each other, that means that they don't really cause the car to vibrate very much because this one's vibrating this way and this one's vibrating that way, and the actual vibrations cancel each other out. So you get a lot of sound, but you don't get very much vibration, which is kind of awesome. This whole subwoofer getup and all the amplifiers and everything were made by a company called Visteon, which is an OE supplier that makes tons of automotive electronics like dashboards and power lock mechanisms and EV motor controllers and all that stuff. So this was stuff they were already probably making for Ford in some other capacity anyways. And in fact, the amplifiers on this, I'm pretty sure are the exact same amplifier they put into the Mach 460 system, just with a couple internal tweaks. Anyway, enough yapping, let's have a listen. And then after we're done listening, I'll take them out of my wife's car and we'll take a look at them on the bench and we'll get kind of more technical about it if you care about that stuff. I think you understand how copyright works, so I'm gonna have to play something kind of generic, but you'll get the idea. Like it gets low. All right, I'm just gonna play a couple of seconds of tracks that you might be more familiar with that have better instrumentation, because this is just off of free library stuff. And we'll play like a couple seconds at a time just so it gets through copyright. Running both of these from just one channel of my wife's Mach 460 audio system, I was really impressed not only with how loud they actually got, but also how deep they got. For being a relatively small enclosure, I know these are big, but the amount of airspace inside them for a 10-inch woofer is actually not that much, and I was surprised by how deep they went, because they got those low lows. It was like rattling my balls around and stuff, so I thought that was pretty neat. Well played, Visteon, on that one. Now, in terms of whether or not you would want to have these, well, they're really hard to come by nowadays, so you won't be able to find a whole lot of them. If you're trying to do like a period correct restoration and you want the factory stuff, I'd say go for these because, I mean, they're period correct. They're from the factory, right? You're not going to get better than that. The guy that bought these, he spent about $1,000 on this stuff, which you'll see in a second. So it's not cheap, but $1,000 ain't worth what it used to be. And the whole set cost, I think, $1,200 in 2003. I think that's what the add-on was $1,200. So, you know, it's kind of lost money, but also it's a rare part. I don't know, make of that what you will. In terms of what I did in order to make it so that it could be operated by another amplifier, because he doesn't plan on running the factory amplifiers with it, I stuck 4 flat trailer wiring harnesses on it, which means that he can just plug this in and unplug it from the other side of the trailer wiring harness. Obviously not from a trailer, but plugged into an amp on the other side. And I also preserved the original connectors here under this heat shrink, which means that the original connectors can still be reassembled if he wants to go back to stock at some point in the future. So all he has to do is just use a razor to cut this away, and then these will clip back into the original plastic plugs, which I'll give him in a baggie. As for the tech specifications, each woofer has dual 4-ohm voice coils, so that's why I've left the wiring the way that it is. So the guy who owns it can wire this up for a single 1-ohm load, or for a single 4-ohm load, or for 2 8-ohm loads, or 2 2-ohm loads, or however he wants to divide that up, or even run 4 individual channels at 4 ohms each. So they can be plugged in any way he wants to in the future and make it pretty versatile. I've also left them with these 4 flat plugs so it can be disconnected and removed from the car if he wants to save some weight or make some extra room in the trunk, because these things are big and heavy. As for the weight, 22 pounds. This thing weighs 22 pounds. This thing weighs 22 pounds. And then this amp rack, this is heavy gauge steel. Like, this is seriously thick stuff. This weighs 13 pounds. The amplifiers that were originally on it would have been about 5 pounds each. And then we've got these things, because remember, this is an OE solution. This is made to survive bouncing around, going on rough roads, possibly getting into a collision without rolling around all over the place. So these weren't just kind of Velcroed in the back there. They've got these giant brackets right here, and these are hard to come by because frequently when people retrieve these things from wrecked cars, they don't get these out from the bottom of the trunk. So these typically cost about as much as the woofers cost to find on eBay. There's also these little brackets here, which just connect to the front of the frame right here, and they tie the woofers into either side of the amp rack so that the amp rack kind of holds everything all solid as a single unit. By the time you add that all up, it's like 80 pounds, give or take, which is like 2 car batteries worth of weight. So you got to really want the bass. It's not going to help you out when you go to the drag strip. The amplifiers that originally powered these things were rated at 85 watts RMS. And so each voice coil was 85 watts RMS, presumably. I don't know what they're actually good for, but that's what the manufacturer built them to do. So 170 watts total for both coils combined, plus 170 watts total. 340 watts, you can do the math on that. That doesn't really sound like a huge number of watts, but remember that watts ain't watts. The car audio is kind of goofy that way. Like, you'll see a cheap amplifier that's like, you know, $59 and it says it does 500 watts. And then you see another amplifier that's like $500 and says 500 watts. And you wonder what the difference is. Put them on a dyno and you'll probably see that the one that's cheaper doesn't actually make as much power as they claim. So watts are kind of funny in that way. And another thing that's kind of funny regarding wattage in audio is that if you start with a more efficient loudspeaker, you need fewer watts to get louder. That's kind of a weird relationship. So as an example, if you have a woofer that says it does 90 decibels at 1 watt, 1 meter, and then you give it 2 watts, it'll make 93 decibels at a distance of a meter. And if you give it 4 watts, it'll make 96 decibels at a distance of a meter. And if you give it 8 watts, then it's going to make 99 decibels. So every doubling of wattage is 3 decibels, and that kind of carries on until you reach the mechanical limits of the speaker. And the reason that makes a really big difference is if you start off with a more efficient speaker, then you need fewer watts to get just as loud. To give you kind of an extreme example, this 12-inch woofer is rated at 82 dB at 1 watt, 1 meter, and this 12-inch PA speaker is rated at 99 dB at 1 watt, 1 meter. What that means is that this PA speaker is just as loud from 1 watt as this subwoofer is from 50 watts. That's a pretty surprising comparison, but that's just kind of how it works out. So if you have a subwoofer that's only rated at like 82 dB at 1 watt, 1 meter, and then for example, if these things here were capable of operating at like 91 dB at 1 watt, 1 meter, they're going to get ridiculously loud on fewer watts than that other subwoofer would require. Now there's a lot more that goes into the engineering of a subwoofer, and this ain't the place to get that deep into it. I just want to make sure that you're aware that even though these are only rated at 340 watts, that doesn't mean they don't get down. You heard that they got, well, maybe you didn't hear, but I heard that they got really loud sharing 85 watts. Like they got satisfyingly loud enough to drown out the front speakers on 85 watts for the pair. So I bet when they're in their heyday doing what they do best, I bet they jam pretty hard. If you're looking for a set of these for your own Mustang, of course be aware that they don't make them anymore and they haven't for a really long time, so the ones that exist out there are all that exist. Now you probably won't be able to get these with the bracketry and the amp rack and everything, but I don't think you need that either, because these guys are held onto the brackets with these little kind of ears here, and I think you could probably fabricate something on your own. I also took the opportunity to see how those brackets mount in the cars. For example, in my wife's New Edge, there are little rubber grommets that you can punch out, and then those brackets are made to drop into those so they can be dealer installed on a New Edge Mustang. Those holes don't exist on an SN95, so if you wanted to get the whole kit and caboodle with the brackets and do them in an SN95, you'd be cutting into your floorboard, and it kind of doesn't really work exactly. I haven't cut obviously in mine, but I held it up and tried to see how it fit, and it's the stamping where the spare tire well and everything is different between these cars. It's not too far off, but it's not the same either. So I wouldn't recommend trying to track down the whole bracketry and all that stuff if you have an SN95. If you have a New Edge, I would recommend tracking them down, because then you have the OEM solution. The amp rack itself, well, this thing doesn't fit right up against the back of the seat back. So for example, when these things are in place, there's still, I don't know, like 8 or 9 inches between this and the back of the fold down back seats, which is a lot of space to give up. So I'm not sure I would include this both for the weight and also because if you're not going to be using the original amplifiers and doing like a fully, period correct, perfectly original type system, this is a lot of space. You could fit a whole lot of amplifiers on this, and all those amplifiers you might fit on this would destroy those speakers if they're modern amps. I also don't think that I would recommend putting other speakers in here than the ones that were made for this, and there's a couple of reasons for that. One of them is that these things, as I mentioned, they scoop pretty low for how small of an enclosure they are, so that tells me the woofers were engineered specifically for this tiny amount of volume. So if you are going to replace the speakers in there, you'd want to try and get ones that are specifically engineered for sealed itty-bitty enclosures so they can make the most of that. The other part of it is that these woofers, they have ridiculously large magnets on them, and then those magnets have threaded holes on the back plate and a little yoke. And I only found this out from looking online. I haven't taken these apart, but I can tell that on the back of this is a nut and a bolt, and that yoke apparently is supporting the rear of the speaker's magnet. So that way, again, if you're abusing the car and driving it hard and you come down hard, it's not going to knock the magnet off because the magnet is supported by the enclosure. And so if you're going to replace these woofers with some other aftermarket woofers, you want to take all that stuff into consideration. They probably won't fit this exactly right. As for cost of getting these things nowadays, I looked up prices on eBay and they're kind of all over the place, but I would expect if you wanted the whole kit and caboodle, you're probably going to be out at least $1,000, probably more than that including shipping, because these things again are heavy and bulky. So I mean, that's a lot of money, but at the same time, like, you have to kind of really want like the OE solution. You want it to look and work like factory, and maybe that's worth it to you. As for me, yeah, I like loud music as much as the next guy, but I'm gonna pass on having a boat anchor back there like this. Anyway, I hope you found this fun. Thanks for watching.